There's something about waiting in a cafe that makes time feel heavier, you know? I remember staring at the foam in my coffee, watching it swirl like it had something to say. My heart was pounding, but I kept telling myself it was fine, just a little talk. But when Dylan walked in, I knew. He didn't even kiss my cheek. No smile, just that cold, clipped tone. You've changed. I want someone younger, more exciting. Like I was an old sweater he'd grown tired of. I didn't argue. What would have been the point? My throat tightened, but I just nodded, trying to look composed. Inside, though, it was chaos, like something had been ripped straight out of my chest. And within days, as if heartbreak wasn't enough, there they were. Him and her, splashed across social media like a high school couple on prom night. Chloe. That was her name. She looked, what? 19, maybe 20, tops. Fresh-faced, perfectly filtered. God, it was humiliating. So I vanished. No dramatic posts, no cryptic quotes, just gone. I stopped replying to mutual friends, turned my phone face down more often than not, and let the silence grow thick around me. But here's what no one knew. I wasn't just hurting. I was planning. Because the thing about being replaced, it burns. But it also wakes something up inside you. And I wasn't about to let that fire go to waste. The worst part wasn't losing him. It was realizing how little I had meant in the end. All the late-night talks, the inside jokes, the tiny rituals we'd built, he tossed them aside like a worn-out paperback. And Chloe didn't even flinch stepping into my place. She smiled in his photos the way I used to, and I wondered, for a while, if maybe I really had become boring. Maybe I had changed. But then I remembered, I grew. He just didn't want to grow with me. Every night I'd lie in bed replaying it all. His words, his face, the cafe. And it wasn't sadness that stayed with me. It was shame. I felt stupid. Used. Like a phase he'd outgrown. But slowly, shame gave way to something else. Something sharper. Cold, yes, but clear. I didn't want him back. I didn't want to cry. I wanted him to regret. And not just once. I wanted him to feel it over and over the way I had. That was the seed. They say revenge isn't healthy, maybe, but it sure is motivating. I began to imagine the look on his face if I came back stronger, stunning, untouchable. If he saw me on someone else's arm, someone who made him feel small. That thought carried me through the hardest days. I didn't need to scream or post cryptic messages. No. I'd make him watch in silence. And the beauty of it? He'd never see it coming. I started with the small things. A haircut that framed my face just right. A new shade of lipstick. Not because I needed to impress anyone, but because it made me look in the mirror a little longer. I updated my wardrobe, walked a little taller. Not out of vanity, but power. Each little change felt like reclaiming a piece of myself he'd made me doubt. I wasn't the woman who begged to stay. I was becoming the woman he'd wish he'd never lost. Of course, I still saw them from time to time. Mutual friends' posts I hadn't muted. There they were. Brunches, beach days, matching Halloween costumes. It looked so happy on the surface. But sometimes, if you paid close attention, you'd catch the cracks. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Her hand clutched his a little too tightly. And me? I just watched. Quietly. Patiently. Because this wasn't going to be about reaction. It was going to be about strategy. You see, pain taught me something Dylan never could. How to play the long game. And one thing about games? You wait for the right move. No rushing. No forcing it. You just watch the board. And one evening, without even trying, that move walked right up to me, wearing a tailored suit and a silver watch with a smile that could melt steel. I wasn't planning to go. The charity gala was one of those work events you RSVP to out of obligation, not excitement. I had every excuse ready: migraine, deadlines, prior plans. But something tugged at me that day. Maybe curiosity, maybe fate. I slipped into a navy dress I hadn't worn in years, added a touch of perfume I'd almost forgotten I loved, and stepped into the evening like I had nothing to lose. That night, I didn't know it yet, but everything was about to shift. The room buzzed with the soft clink of champagne flutes and polite laughter. Velvet curtains, golden candlelight, the kind of elegance that made you feel like you were in someone else's story. I was mid-sip when I noticed the seat beside mine had just been filled. He turned to me with the most charming smile, warm, not rehearsed. "I'm Richard," he said, holding out his hand. His voice was calm, confident, and instantly, something about him made me feel seen. We talked. For hours, it felt like. About art, travel, the absurdity of influencer culture. He was witty, self-assured, effortlessly present. No wandering eyes, no checking his phone. Just him, leaning in, listening, like I was the only woman in the room. He mentioned he was divorced, grown daughter. Didn't give too many details, and I didn't press. It wasn't until later that night, scrolling through his last name out of curiosity, that it hit me like a punch to the chest. Richard was Chloe's father. I stared at his profile photo for a solid minute, barely breathing. Same eyes, same last name. I even remembered seeing him once in the background of one of Chloe's beach selfies, looking like a dad who didn't want to be there. But tonight he was magnetic, confident, and completely unaware of who I was. My heart raced, not with fear, but with something darker. Possibility. There he was, Chloe's father, completely enchanted by me, and I hadn't even tried. I didn't tell him. Not then. Not even when he leaned in at the end of the evening and said, "Would you let me take you to dinner sometime?" I smiled. Not out of politeness. I meant it. I felt this strange, delicious power ripple through me, like I'd been handed the sharpest tool without asking for it. Was it coincidence? Karma? I didn't care. All I knew was that the universe had just served me something I hadn't even dared to imagine. When I got home that night, I kicked off my heels and laughed. The kind of laugh that comes from disbelief and anticipation crashing into each other. I could have blocked his number, ghosted him, walked away. But I didn't. Because for the first time since Dylan left me for Chloe, I felt in control. Not by chasing revenge, but by attracting it. And if life was going to offer me a front row seat to this strange twist of fate, I sure as hell wasn't going to sit in the back. Our first dinner was effortless. The kind where you lose track of time and forget to check your reflection when you excuse yourself to the bathroom. Richard had that rare ability to make you feel like nothing else mattered. Not the past, not the noise, not even the wounds you'd covered in silk. He wasn't just charming. He was generous with his attention, curious about my thoughts. Not once did I feel like I was performing. I was just me, and he liked me. Part of me kept waiting for guilt to sneak in. For some sign that I was crossing a line too messy to untangle. But it never came. There was no grand plan, no timeline, no script, just this unfolding tension between reality and irony. The daughter he adored was the girl who had smiled in my boyfriend's arms, and now here I was, making her father laugh over wine and tiramisu, wondering how long I could keep this delicious secret to myself. I didn't ask where it was going. Not yet. I didn't need to. Because for once, I wasn't chasing anything. I was letting it come to me. And whatever this thing with Richard was turning into, I wasn't ready to walk away. Not now. Not with so many layers still waiting to be peeled back. After all, some games only get more fun once the stakes start to rise. What started as a strategic little spark quickly caught fire, the kind you don't want to put out. I thought I could keep it surface level. Charming, poised, in control. But Richard made that impossible. Every dinner turned into a conversation I didn't want to end. Every glance across a crowded room lingered a beat too long. And the way he looked at me, like I was something rare, like he was grateful just to be near me. It was intoxicating. He was nothing like Dylan. Dylan always looked at his phone more than my eyes, always needed to be the cleverest one in the room. Richard didn't compete, he connected. He asked about my family, my dreams, the places I still wanted to visit, and he listened. really listened. No pretense, no angle, just this quiet steadiness that made me feel safe. And isn't that funny? That safety could feel so thrilling when it comes after chaos. Meanwhile, Chloe and Dylan's highlight reel romance started to look less curated. Words started to trickle in from mutual acquaintances, tense dinners, awkward comments, Chloe complaining about how Dylan keeps checking out older women. I could have laughed, but I didn't. I just tucked it away like a little gemstone, a private souvenir from a storm I'd already survived. Because as their picture-perfect edges started to crack, mine were beginning to glow. We fell into a rhythm, Richard and I. Not rushed, not reckless, just unfolding. Some mornings he'd send me articles he thought I'd like. Other nights he'd call just to hear how my day went. It wasn't grand gestures that won me over. It was the consistency, the ease, the quiet confidence in his affection. I never had to wonder where I stood with him, and after years of loving someone who made me question my worth, that feeling was gold. And yet, beneath all that warmth, I won't lie, there was a delicious edge to it, a private thrill every time I imagined Chloe finding out. I didn't seek it, but I wasn't afraid of it either. Part of me wanted the confrontation, not for the drama, but for the irony. Because how do you even begin to explain to your 20-something self that your boyfriend's ex is now holding your father's hand across a white linen tablecloth? I didn't have to imagine it for long. It happened one Sunday, at an upscale brunch spot on the north side. I hadn't known Chloe would be there, but I certainly didn't walk away. She walked in, stopped cold, and I watched the blood drain from her face. Richard looked up, beamed, and said cheerfully, "Chloe, come meet someone very special." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. And me? I smiled, steady, calm. "Hi, Chloe. Small world, huh?" She blinked like she was trying to wake up from a nightmare. Richard, sweet as ever, completely unaware, kept talking about how proud he was of his daughter, how excited he was for us to get to know each other better. I watched her squirm, and for a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered how easily she stepped into my life, wore it like it was hers, and flaunted it like a trophy. No, she could sit with the discomfort for once. She hissed through clenched teeth, "Are you serious, Dad? She's my age." I tilted my head, still smiling. "Funny," I said, voice light as champagne bubbles. "That's exactly what Dylan said about you." The silence that followed was rich. Richard raised an eyebrow, completely confused, while Chloe's face turned a shade of red I'd never seen on a human before. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. Sometimes silence does more damage than words ever could. That brunch changed everything. The line had been crossed, not in secret, but in daylight, in front of everyone who mattered. From that moment on, I wasn't just the woman Dylan had left. I was the woman Chloe would now have to look at across holiday tables, engagement parties, maybe even a wedding aisle. And oh, the thought of what came next? It tasted sweeter than anything I'd ever ordered from that overpriced brunch menu. Paris was everything they say it is, romantic, cinematic, a little cliché, and yet somehow still perfect. Richard planned the whole weekend without telling me a thing. A suite with a balcony view of the Seine, wine at lunch, candlelit dinners with live jazz humming in the background. I kept waiting for the moment to feel too much, too orchestrated. But it never did. He made it feel natural, like this was just our life now. And honestly, I started to believe it could be. The proposal came on our second night, just after dessert, beneath a sky the color of spilled ink. He reached across the table, took my hand in both of his, and told me he hadn't felt this alive in years. There was no speech, no kneeling, just a simple question full of warmth. "Will you marry me?" And I said yes. Without hesitation, not for revenge, not for image, but because somehow in this wild twist of fate, I had fallen in love with the man I never saw coming. When the news went public, the internet did what it always does. It lit up. Friends, colleagues, acquaintances from college I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly in my inbox. But the reaction I was waiting for came in silence. Dylan didn't reach out. Not a word. But I knew he saw it. The engagement photo was impossible to miss. Me in a cream silk dress, Richard's arms around my waist, both of us glowing. I was engaged to Chloe's father. And Dylan? He was suddenly very, very quiet. The day after we announced it, I went for a walk alone. Just to feel the air on my face, to let it all settle. My life had shifted again, but this time, I wasn't losing anything. I was becoming something. And the best part? I didn't chase it. I didn't scheme or seduce. I just let it come to me. And now, here I was, the future stepmother of the girl who once smiled down at me from Dylan's arm like I was nothing but a cautionary tale. The invitations were printed within the week, elegant, understated, thick cream cardstock with gold lettering. Engagement party, hosted at Richard's estate, of course, catered, live music, all the trimmings. I made a very specific request, 2 invitations to be delivered by hand, one addressed to Chloe, one to Dylan. I told Richard it would be more personal that way. He smiled, charmed by my thoughtfulness. He had no idea the layers hidden underneath. I wore white when I delivered them, a crisp, tailored dress, hair down, just a little curled at the ends. I walked right up to Chloe's front door, their door, the one she had once flaunted like a prize, and rang the bell. Dylan opened it. I smiled. He didn't. "Hi," I said sweetly. "I thought you two would like to come celebrate. Richard and I are engaged." His face did something strange, like it forgot which emotion to pick. Chloe appeared behind him, wide-eyed and speechless. It was perfect. They didn't say a word at first. Just stood there, blinking, as if they'd both seen a ghost. I held the invitations out, one in each hand, like I was offering peace, when really, we all knew better. Chloe finally reached for hers, her fingers trembling just enough for me to notice. Dylan's jaw clenched. He looked like he wanted to speak, but couldn't find words that wouldn't taste like regret. I waited, smiling. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. This was what healing looked like, in heels and white linen. I turned before they could muster anything to say. No need to drag it out. Let them replay the moment again and again, trying to make sense of how the story had flipped. As I walked back to my car, I didn't feel smug. I felt centered. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. About watching the people who broke me finally feel the weight of what they threw away, not in a blaze of fury, but in the quiet collapse of their illusion. Back home, Richard poured me a glass of wine and asked how my errands had gone. I just smiled and kissed him on the cheek. "Lovely," I said, meaning every word. And as the evening light spilled across our living room, I knew the best part was still coming. Because the invitations had only been delivered. The real moment, the one they'd never forget, was waiting on the other side of those RSVP cards. The night of the engagement party, the air felt different, thick with anticipation, like everyone sensed something was about to happen, even if they couldn't name it. The estate was glowing, lanterns lined the stone paths, soft jazz drifted across the lawn, and inside, everything sparkled, the lights, the glasses, even the guests. I stood at the top of the staircase for a moment before descending, letting the sight sink in. This was no longer a fantasy. This was mine. I wore a gown that flowed like water, ivory silk, off the shoulder, fitted just enough to command attention without begging for it. Richard looked up as I walked down, his eyes warm with admiration, pride, maybe even disbelief that he'd found something new at this stage in his life. I didn't need a spotlight. He gave it to me just by the way he looked at me. And that kind of love, that quiet, steady kind, it has a way of softening even the sharpest edges inside you, but not all of them. Because as I made my way through the crowd, kissing cheeks, accepting compliments, I spotted them. Standing off to the side like party crashers who'd realized too late they didn't belong. Dylan looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Chloe had her arms crossed so tightly across her chest, she might have been holding herself together. I didn't say a word. I just raised my glass, nodded once, and moved on. My presence was enough. My silence, even more so. As the evening unfolded, everything shimmered. The laughter, the music, the flow of champagne. But beneath it all, there was a hum, subtle, electric. People sensed it, a story in the room no one had the full pages of, and at the center of it, I stood still and calm, holding it all together like a beautifully wrapped secret. I could feel their eyes on me. Dylan's confusion, Chloe's anger, neither of them able to confront me without unraveling the lies they'd built for themselves. And then came the moment, the toast. Richard clinked his glass, and all chatter faded like mist. He turned to me, lifted his flute, and said something sweet, heartfelt, a little awkward in the way only sincere men sound. Everyone smiled, applauded politely. Then he looked at me and said, "Go on, love. Say something." I didn't hesitate. I stepped forward, took the mic, and let the room settle before I spoke. My voice was steady. I'd waited for this, not out of bitterness, but clarity. To second chances, I began, letting the words land like silk. To the unexpected paths that lead us to the right place, to healing, to love, and I looked directly at Chloe and Dylan, to poetic justice. A few people laughed, others just blinked, unsure of what I meant. But the ones who needed to understand, they did. Chloe's glass clinked awkwardly as she set it down too hard. Dylan looked at the floor, and I smiled gently, like a woman who'd finally set down her burden. I didn't drag it out. Just raised my glass a little higher and added, "To being right where I belong." Then I took a sip, calm as ever, and let the silence settle. It wasn't dramatic. There was no need for theatrics, just the quiet weight of truth, suspended in a room full of people who felt it ripple through their chests. Chloe stormed out first, heels clicking angrily across marble. Dylan lingered by the doorway, like maybe he wanted to say something. But he didn't. He knew better. Richard slid his hand into mine as I stepped down from the small platform. "That was elegant," he whispered with a smile. I leaned into his shoulder, letting the warmth of the moment wash over me. Not because I'd won, but because I no longer needed to prove anything. The girl who once cried over a breakup in a cafe was gone. In her place stood a woman who had built something new, not out of spite, but strength. Later that night, as the guests thinned and laughter gave way to candlelight, I stood at the base of the grand staircase in my wedding gown. Richard was at the top, waiting for me. And as I climbed each step, I didn't feel nervous or unsure. I felt whole. I reached him, took his hand, and looked out into the quiet evening. And just before we disappeared into our new life, I let the final truth land softly in my mind, like a secret meant just for me. He left me for someone younger. Now I'm calling her daughter,